Hello, my name is Connor Quinlan, and in this review I'm going to be doing another review on the Nikon d700 versus the Nikon d300. The reason I'm doing this review again is because mine was deleted off of YouTube for copyright issues with the music that I had on it, which doesn't make any sense. It's really stupid, but it happens, so I find this as an opportunity to redo it and make it better than last time. And the first issue I want to go over with these cameras is which one should you buy? Well, that's a pretty tough question considering that they're really not the same camera at all. They're in completely different classes and really shouldn't be put up against each other because they serve two totally different purposes. Let's start with the D300 first. So what's really the big difference between the D300 and the D700? Well, it's the sensor. The sensor in the D300 is what's called a DX sensor, which means that it's 1.5 times smaller than the D700 sensor, which is full frame or FX, as Nikon calls it. Now, 1.5 or DX sensor give you over a full frame sensor? Well, it actually gives you more reach, meaning that you can get closer to your subjects with any given lens. For example, I have a 70 to 200 millimeter lens on here. If I set it to 200 millimeter, I'm actually getting the equivalent of 300 millimeter. Whereas if you put this on a full frame camera like the D700, you're still only getting 200 millimeter. So the D300 will actually get you 1.5 times closer to the subject than the D700 per se. And that's really good for things like sports, wildlife, things where you have to get really close up. And why that's also an advantage is because since you can get a 300 millimeter focal length with something like 70 to 200 with an f-stop 2.8, that means you won't have to buy something like a 300 millimeter lens, which is like $6,000 and weighs about 6 pounds. That's what you'd have to buy for the D700 to get the equivalent of what you would get with the 70 to 200 millimeter lens set at 200 on the D300. Now let's go on to the D700. Now, the D700 is full frame, so what that means is that it gets a lot wider angles than you would get on the D300. If we're talking about just Nikon lenses, then the D300 with a Nikon's widest lens, 12 to 24 for it, could only give you about equivalent to 18 to 35 millimeter. Whereas with the D700 you could get something like a 14 to 24, which is quite a bit wider than something you could get for the D300. Now yes, you could get wider angles with third-party lenses for the Nikon D300, but you won't get good image quality. You're just not going to get the image quality that you would if you went with a Nikon lens. So now a question that I'm going to answer is, why is the D700 so much more expensive than the D300? Well, it is due mainly to its full-frame sensor. Since it's 1.5 times larger than the D700 sensor, it costs quite a bit more. Now, what will a sensor like that give you over a D300? And why is it so much more expensive? Well, a D700 sensor is actually quite a bit more advanced than the D300 sensor in the sense that it creates a lot less noise at much higher ISOs. So say you're in a really dark room and you're taking a picture at ISO 3200. With a D300 you get quite a bit of noise in that picture, and it probably wouldn't be printable at large prints. Whereas with the D700, if you take a picture at 3200 ISO, you get a picture that's a lot cleaner, with a lot less noise, and that you can print out a lot bigger without losing a lot of image quality. Keep in mind though, and this is just a warning to those people who don't use higher ISOs, the megapixel difference between the D700 and D300 is, there is no difference basically. They have the exact same amount of megapixels, and if you're taking pictures at ISO 100 to ISO 200, the pictures are going to look essentially the same. The image quality is no better on the D700 at lower ISOs, so just keep that in mind. So other than focal length of the two and the sensors, what makes these two different as well? Well, the next big difference between the two cameras is the viewfinder. On a D300 you got a pretty decent viewfinder, the best of all the DX cameras. It's got 100% frame coverage. It's pretty big and pretty bright, but it's nothing compared to a D700's viewfinder, which doesn't have as much coverage, but it's a lot bigger. In fact, if you look through the viewfinder, it's kind of like the sensor. It's 1.5 times bigger inside the prism up here, so you get a much bigger view and a much brighter view. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, a DX viewfinder might look something like this. It's about that big, per se. And then a D700's viewfinder is going to be like this. So you're going to see a much bigger viewfinder when you look through it, and you're going to see a lot more things, and it's going to be a lot brighter since it lets in more light. And those are essentially the main differences between the D300 and the D700. The D700 doesn't have a lot of controls over the D300. It has a couple little tweaks that people probably won't even notice. Its active D lighting has an extra setting called auto, which could be useful for some people, which means that you don't have to choose which type of active D lighting you want. And also it has a nice info button on the back that's completely dedicated to itself, so you don't have to look for that info button to get the nice info screen on the LCD in the back. So from the description you can see that the D700 and D300 are essentially two completely different cameras. One could be the camera for you and one cannot be the camera for you. However, both can also be the camera for you as well, since they're two completely different cameras. I know I like to take pictures of landscape and wildlife, so a full frame camera and a DX camera would be really useful for me in my case. But honestly, a lot of us don't really have enough money to spend on both of these cameras unless we're full-time photographers. So how do you get a DX camera and a full-frame camera without paying too much? The easy way to do that is to get something like D300, which is DX, and then get a film camera, a pretty cheap film camera. You can actually get really nice film cameras like a Nikon F100 for used at Adorama or B&H Photo Video for around not much more than $200. And finally, last thing I want to talk about is that the D700 alone is a very expensive camera. But if you're going to get a D700, you're going to need to get pretty expensive lenses as well to get that really wide angle or to get the image quality that you'd want on a D700. If you got a D700, to get the wide angle that you want, you'd have to get something like a 14-24, which costs like $1,500 extra. Whereas with the D300, you could buy a third-party lens for that for less than $500, or even the 12-24 for $800, $750 or so, which is a lot less expensive than lenses cost with a Nikon D700. Now you can get cheap lenses, cheap full-frame lenses for the D700, but it's really not worth doing it. If getting the D300, if you're going to do that, you might as well get the D300 and use the extra money to get really nice lenses for it. It's always best to buy better lenses rather than better cameras. That is pretty much the end of my review. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, just let me know. And this has been a review between the Nikon D700 and the D300.